pre-dawn light barely touched the curves of the Blue Ridge foothills, a ghostly fog rolling thick and silent across the two-lane road. Cassidy Blake gripped the steering wheel tighter, the ache in her shoulders deepening with every mile. Night shifts at the hospital always left her hollow, but this morning felt different, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The headlights of her aging Subaru barely pierced the mist. Asheville was behind her, quiet and blue in the rearview mirror. Every tree and fence post blurred together until, suddenly, there was movement. Cassidy's foot tapped the brake. There, just ahead, half concealed by low-hanging fog, stood a brown horse, unmoving on the shoulder, as if sculpted from the night itself. Cassidy pulled over, heart hammering. Instinct warred with exhaustion. Who left a horse out here? She stepped from the warmth of her car, the mountain air biting. As she moved closer, the horse didn't bolt. He just stood there, legs rooted to the ground, eyes dull and empty, sides shivering beneath a crust of mud and wounds. "Hey, boy," she whispered, keeping her voice low and soft. "You're all right. I'm not going to hurt you." She kept her distance, watching. His ribs jutted beneath his coat, his mane tangled, a thin scar showing on his flank. Up close, the air filled with the scent of wet earth and old fear. But it was the look in his eyes, a vacant, haunted gaze, that shook her. Cassidy had seen that look in her patients, and sometimes in her own mirror. For a moment, neither moved. Her mind flashed back to the little brother she'd once sworn to protect. She'd failed him, just as someone had failed this animal. But Cassidy had learned. Sometimes the only thing you can do is show up again and again, no matter how tired or broken you feel. A distant rumble snapped her back. She turned to see headlights cresting the hill, a logging truck, its beams sweeping wide across the mist. Cassidy moved fast. She opened her borrowed horse trailer, coaxing the animal forward with gentle words and outstretched hands. For a heartbeat, he hesitated, muscles tense. But something in her tone, or maybe just the sheer quiet desperation in her eyes, nudged him forward. He walked in, hooves stumbling, and Cassidy locked the gate behind him. The truck roared past, close enough to rattle her bones. Cassidy pressed her hand to the horse's neck, feeling his shivers. Her fingers found a rough old halter, the fabric frayed and faded. She traced the stitched word with her thumb. Hope. A shiver ran through her, not just from the cold, but from the sudden unspoken weight of all the lives that had once touched this animal. Back in the driver's seat, Cassidy exhaled. The horse shifted in the trailer, the metal creaking. 100 questions stormed her mind. Who had abandoned him? What had happened to leave him so hollowed out? And most of all, what was she supposed to do now, with a traumatized horse and her own barely held together life? The drive home was slow, the mist thickening, turning the world dreamlike. Every time she glanced in the rearview mirror, she half expected the horse to vanish, like something conjured by exhaustion and memory. But he stayed, a silent passenger, his presence unsettling and strangely hopeful. She talked to him as she drove, voice shaking out confessions she hadn't dared speak in years. She told him about the kids she worked with, how sometimes just holding a hand made all the difference. She spoke of her brother, lost somewhere out there, a wound that never quite healed. The horse, brave, she'd call him brave for now, made no sound, but his ears twitched, listening, or maybe just remembering some old pain of his own. As she pulled up to the old barn behind her cottage, the first birds began to call through the fog. Cassidy got out, legs heavy with worry. She opened the trailer, heart thudding, half expecting the horse to rear or bolt. But Brave just stood, head lowered, waiting. She led him to the stable, her boots crunching on wet gravel, his hooves dragging through the mud. Inside, the barn smelled of straw and rain. Cassidy grabbed an old blanket, rubbing down his shaking sides, feeling every rib and old scar beneath her palms. She found herself humming, a tune from childhood, the notes soft and uncertain in the quiet. Brave's breathing slowed, his shivers easing. Cassidy's own shoulders relaxed a little. There, in the half-light, she noticed again the faded word stitched in blue. Hope. It made her wonder about the child who once believed in this horse, and about the stories that get stitched into us, even when we think we're broken beyond repair. As the mist lifted outside, Cassidy sat on the straw, back against the wall. Brave stood near her, still and silent, a battered sentinel holding vigil over the bruised dawn. The world outside felt far away. The road, the hospital, the aching memory of loss, all blurred into something softer by the quiet presence of another living soul who knew what it was to be abandoned and to survive. And as the first rays of sunlight crept through the cracks in the barn wall, Cassidy realized she had already made a choice, long before she'd pulled over. Sometimes the road you think you're lost on is the only one that leads you home. Cassidy barely slept. All night she listened to Brave shifting in his stall, the old barn groaning with every gust of wind. Even the sunrise seemed wary, filtering through gray clouds as she loaded the horse into the trailer once more, this time bound for Dr. Mallory Finch's veterinary clinic on the outskirts of Asheville. The road curled through familiar country. Cassidy's hands tightened on the wheel, her mind a blur of worries. Was she doing the right thing? She barely had enough money for groceries some weeks, let alone vet bills for a horse she'd found by accident. Still, as she glanced back at Brave, quiet, unmoving, but present, she felt something shift in her chest, a sense of responsibility deeper than logic. Dr. Finch's barn stood behind a white farmhouse at the end of a gravel drive. Cassidy had met her once, during a school visit with a patient who wanted to learn about horses. The vet, all practical warmth and worn jeans, welcomed her inside. "You said he was abandoned?" Dr. Finch asked, her voice low, glancing at Brave's battered frame. Cassidy nodded, feeling strangely protective. Found him on the road. He didn't even flinch when a truck flew past. The exam room was cool and sunlit. Brave balked at the threshold, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. Cassidy stood at his head, murmuring nonsense, trying to keep her own nerves from bleeding into the air. Every brush, every sudden sound, made Brave tense, his body rigid with old fears. Dr. Finch worked gently. She ran practiced hands over Brave's ribs, checked his hooves, examined the blue halter. "He's been hungry for a while. Some old scars, but nothing infected. He's young, maybe 5. You did right bringing him in." Cassidy watched Brave's eyes, searching for any flicker of trust, but the horse seemed locked away somewhere unreachable, only tolerating the exam because he had no fight left. Dr. Finch frowned, reaching for a scanner. "Let's check for a microchip just in case." A pause, the quiet hum of the device, then a beep. "He's chipped," Dr. Finch said. She turned to her computer, tapping in numbers. Cassidy waited, the barn's silence heavy around her. Brave shifted, his ears flicking back and forth. After a moment, Dr. Finch looked up, something new in her expression. "He was registered as a therapy horse, Cassidy. for a child named Jamie Weston. The last record says Jamie passed away this spring. Cassidy's breath caught. What happened to him after? Dr. Finch picked up the phone, found Jamie's mother's number, and stepped outside. Cassidy stayed in the barn, her hand resting on Brave's neck, feeling the tension humming through the horse and herself. The call took a long time. Finally, Dr. Finch returned, eyes wet. Jamie's mother. She couldn't bear to come to the stable after her son died. She says she's sorry, so sorry. The family just broke apart. The horse disappeared. She thought maybe he'd been rehomed or... She didn't know. The words landed hard. Cassidy felt a wave of grief for this unseen family, their love and loss echoing through the cold barn. Brave seemed to sense the shift. Muscles quivering, Cassidy pressed her forehead to his, a silent offering of comfort neither quite knew how to give. Dr. Finch spoke gently. His last stable bill was paid by a charity. No one ever came for him, Cassidy. He's been alone since. Cassidy closed her eyes, the barn spinning. She pictured Brave waiting for someone who never came, the hope stitched in his halter growing more frayed with each day. Something in her, a part she'd walled off after losing her brother, cracked open. Outside, rain began to tap against the roof, steady and relentless. Dr. Finch wrote a prescription for feed and pain medicine, then handed Cassidy a thin file. If you want, you can keep him. No one's claimed him in months. He deserves better than what he's had. Cassidy nodded, swallowing a lump in her throat. I'll try. The barn felt vast and empty as Dr. Finch left. Cassidy stayed, leaning against the stall, watching Brave, watching herself in the shadowy reflection of his eyes. Alone together, they shared the same unspoken question. Was either of them strong enough to begin again? Night fell early, clouds swallowing the last scraps of sun. Cassidy didn't leave until the clinic lights dimmed and Dr. Finch's pickup rolled out of the driveway. She stayed in the cold barn, silent, listening to Brave shift and sigh. It struck her how quickly hope could slip through your fingers, how easily people and animals could be forgotten. But there was something stubborn in Cassidy, a quiet refusal to give up, even when she felt hollowed out. She remembered a child at the hospital, paralyzed by fear, who'd reached out and squeezed her hand. Sometimes the smallest connection, the softest gesture, could anchor you to the world again. Before leaving, Cassidy found herself kneeling in Brave's stall, whispering stories of Asheville, her childhood, the stubborn love that kept her going. Brave didn't move, but his breathing steadied, and for a moment, the space between them felt warmer. It was a start. As Cassidy locked up and stepped into the drizzle, she paused. Behind her, Brave stood at the stall door, ears forward, watching. Not with hope, not yet, but with something like curiosity. The beginnings of trust, perhaps, or the memory of it. Cassidy made a silent promise, her breath fogging in the cold. She would not abandon him, no matter how lost she felt, no matter the cost. She would stand by this horse, because sometimes all you could do was show up, and in doing so, offer hope, even in the darkest barn on the loneliest night. Cassidy's little house stood on the edge of town, perched where the fields broke open into the first folds of the Blue Ridge. That morning, mist clung to the grass and telephone wires, making the world soft and gray. Brave's trailer creaked as she backed it up to her barn, small, drafty, but a refuge, at least for now. She led Brave into the empty stable, the old boards groaning beneath their steps. Light slanted in through a high window, falling across fresh straw and a feed bucket she'd filled, in hope more than certainty. Brave paused just inside the door, nostrils flaring, ears flicking at the unfamiliar space. Cassidy unlatched the lead rope and waited. For hours, Brave stood exactly where she'd left him, as if glued to the spot. He didn't explore, didn't touch his food or water, only stared at the open door with that hollow-eyed stillness that reminded Cassidy of the long waiting rooms of her childhood. Sometimes, when her mother was sick, she'd watched the clock tick and waited for news that never came. Now, years later, she saw the same quiet ache in this horse. Cassidy settled herself in the straw nearby, knees drawn to her chest, her back against the wall. She kept her voice low, speaking not to fill the silence but to make it gentler. She told Brave stories about the children she worked with, funny moments, fierce little triumphs, days when a child moved a finger or smiled for the first time in months. The words spilled out, not as a performance but as confessions she'd never made, not even to herself. She spoke about her brother Michael, lost to the system after their parents died. She'd tried so hard to hold their lives together, but grief and bureaucracy had separated them. Michael had grown up somewhere she couldn't reach, and the distance between them was a wound she carried quietly, like an old bruise that never really healed. Brave didn't answer, didn't move, but he listened, the way only animals can. The barn filled with a heavy, quiet presence, a sense that something invisible was slowly mending, stitch by stitch, in the spaces between her words. That night, rain beat against the tin roof. Cassidy pulled a blanket around her shoulders and curled up on a pile of hay, refusing to leave Brave alone. The horse stood in the corner, his sides trembling with dreams. Several times he jolted awake, legs shivering, eyes wild with memories that Cassidy could only guess at. She didn't try to touch him or speak. She just let herself be there, offering silent company. The storm outside raged on, but in the stable it was the hush, the sense of not being alone, that mattered. At some point, Cassidy's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Jamie's mother, tentative, a little lost. He used to love lullabies. Sometimes Jamie sang to him when he was scared. Maybe try. Cassidy held the phone for a long moment, thinking of the child she'd never met, whose absence filled the stable as much as the horse's presence. She hesitated, voice trembling, then began to hum an old tune she remembered from her own childhood. The melody was simple, lilting, a comfort passed down from mother to daughter, from boy to horse, and now from stranger to stranger in the half-dark. For a long time, nothing changed. Then, as Cassidy's voice faded, Brave's ear flicked toward her, a small, almost invisible movement. It was enough. Cassidy felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of loneliness and guilt she'd carried for too long. Dawn seeped slowly into the barn, painting the world gold. Brave was standing closer to her now, not quite touching, but no longer pressed into the corner. Cassidy uncurled, bones stiff, and gently laid out fresh hay and water. She worked quietly, letting Brave choose his own pace, grateful for every tiny sign of trust. Outside, the world was waking up. A bluebird sang on the fence post, and the air was sweet with the smell of new grass. Cassidy stepped out for a moment, breathing in the sharp scent of rain-soaked earth, the mountains hidden beneath lingering fog. She thought about the kids she saw every day, how progress was always measured in inches, never miles. By late morning, Cassidy found Brave dozing, legs tucked beneath him. The barn felt less empty, more like a space where healing might happen. She sent a quick message back to Jamie's mother. "He's safe. I sang for him. Thank you." She wondered if that message would bring comfort, or only more pain, to a family still fractured by loss. Later that afternoon, as the sun warmed the boards, Cassidy sat beside Brave, reading a book aloud just for the comfort of the sound. She talked about Michael, about Asheville, about hope, always that word, hope, stitched into the blue halter still looped around Brave's neck. The silence between woman and horse wasn't awkward. It was heavy but full, like a deep breath after a long cry. Cassidy realized she didn't have to fix everything right now. She just had to stay, to witness, to let healing work at its own slow pace. As night returned, Brave ate a little hay. Cassidy sat with him until the barn grew dark and the stars shimmered through the window. She hummed Jamie's lullaby once more, and this time Brave's ears perked, his breathing quiet and steady. Cassidy leaned her head back, looking at the old rafters above. She missed her brother, missed the sense of family, but in the quiet of the empty stable, she found a strange kind of peace, a promise that even in emptiness, something new could take root. The world outside moved on, unknowing. Inside the barn, two lives, battered, uncertain, had begun, just barely, to trust that healing might be possible after all. Mornings in the foothills were cool and bright. Each sunrise painted Cassidy's small world gold, the light slanting across the empty stable, cutting through leftover shadows. Brave greeted every day from the same place, near the door, cautious but alert, never quite stepping outside unless Cassidy led the way. She understood the feeling. Sometimes the hardest part was leaving the safety of what you knew, even if that place was loneliness itself. Cassidy made it a ritual. Before her hospital shifts, before any phone calls or reminders about bills, she brewed coffee, pulled on boots, and padded out to the barn. Brave would watch her come, his brown eyes wary, ears flicking at every sound. But he never turned away. The first few mornings, she did little more than sit nearby with her mug, reading aloud from old storybooks or just letting the barn fill with the quiet sound of her presence. There was a calm to those hours, something slow and sacred. Cassidy brushed Brave's coat gently, careful never to move too fast. She talked softly about her patients, the children whose courage always humbled her. She explained the small routines of her days, oat mash in the mornings, fresh straw at dusk, the way she always left the barn door cracked so Brave could see the sunrise if he chose. Little by little, Brave began to respond. Some mornings he would edge closer when she brought his feed, nostrils quivering at the scent. Once, when she was replacing the water bucket, Brave lowered his head and sniffed at the worn hem of her jeans, lingering there, as if reading some secret history in the threadbare fabric. The barn became a place of slow repair. Cassidy brought in a battered rocking chair, a stack of library books, and a battered basket of therapy supplies, soft toys, sensory balls, picture cards she used with anxious children. She set them out along a low shelf, half for her own comfort, half in the hope Brave might grow curious. One morning, as sunlight warmed the wooden walls, Brave nudged a framed photo from the shelf with his nose. Cassidy caught it before it fell, startled at first, then overcome. The photo was old, her and Michael, arms thrown around each other, both grinning beneath the boughs of their childhood backyard. It was the only picture she had left from before everything fell apart. Cassidy sank to the straw, photo clutched in her lap. Tears stung her eyes, hot and relentless. She didn't hide them. For the first time in years, she let herself weep in front of someone else. Someone who understood, in his own way, what it meant to be left behind. Brave stood close, not touching, but his gentle presence was enough. In the soft, sunlit quiet, Cassidy felt grief flow out of her. Not gone, not cured, but less sharp, softened by the horse's silent witness. That evening, as the sky burned orange, Cassidy lingered in the barn, reluctant to leave. She sat in the straw, reading aloud from a worn fairy tale. Brave, who had always stayed a careful distance, stepped closer. His shadow stretched beside hers, their breaths mingling in the cool air. Cassidy kept reading, voice steady, heart thudding. Brave finally lowered himself to the straw beside her, the space between them closing by inches. Night settled in, the barn filled with soft sounds. Brave's slow chewing, Cassidy's steady breathing, the distant chorus of crickets beyond the walls. It was nothing and everything, a quiet miracle of trust unfolding on its own time. A week later, Cassidy noticed something new. Whenever she gathered her therapy supplies in the barn, preparing for her next hospital session, Brave watched with unusual focus. He'd tilt his head when she picked up a stuffed animal or seemed to perk up at the jingle of sensory bells. Cassidy remembered what Jamie's mother had said about Brave's gentle nature with children. Maybe it was more than memory. Maybe it was longing. On impulse, Cassidy set up a makeshift therapy station at one end of the barn, just a blanket, some toys, and a notebook. She began to practice simple routines, explaining each step as if to an audience. Brave circled her, cautious but attentive, curiosity flickering in his gaze. She encouraged him with small, patient words, letting him approach or retreat as he needed. Sometimes, when Cassidy felt overwhelmed by bills, by loneliness, by the ache of missing Michael, she'd rest her head against Brave's side, feeling his warmth seep into her. His presence was a steady anchor, something to hold on to when her own hope felt as fragile as his halter's faded stitching. The days passed. Cassidy kept up her morning rituals, building trust one small act at a time. Brave became braver, sometimes greeting her with a soft nicker or nosing at the gate when she returned from work. The barn, once a hollow space of grief, filled with new life, a rhythm of healing, a fragile partnership. Still, Cassidy wondered if she was doing enough. Some wounds, she knew, ran too deep for easy fixes, but every morning, when the sun lit up Brave's wide blaze and the blue halter shimmered in the light, Cassidy felt a fragile, growing hope, not for the past, or even for a perfect future, but for the small miracle of two wounded souls learning to trust, together, day by day. And on the nights when sleep would not come, Cassidy would sit in the barn, singing the lullaby Jamie once sang to Brave, letting the gentle melody wrap around them both like a promise. No one is truly alone, not while hope is still breathing in the dark. Spring crept quietly across Asheville, painting the foothills with tender green. By now, the barn had become a world apart, Cassidy's own liminal space where hope felt possible, if fragile. Brave, once a silent shadow, was changing in small, ordinary ways. A brighter look in his eye, a nicker when Cassidy arrived, a tentative step closer as she spread fresh straw on the stable floor. Healing, she realized, never arrived in a single moment. It unfolded day by day, as gently and unpredictably as the dawn. Brave began to eat better, the harsh outlines of his ribs softening. He watched Cassidy with mounting curiosity as she moved around the barn, sometimes following her to the paddock, sometimes standing at the door, one hoof lifted, as if considering an invitation he wasn't quite ready to accept. Cassidy didn't push. Instead, she focused on consistency, Soft words, slow movements, always leaving space for Brave to come to her. One afternoon, she sat on the barn steps, sunlight warming her shoulders, her therapy kit open in her lap. She was prepping materials for her next session. A little girl named Hazel, recovering from a car accident, whose world had shrunk to the dimensions of a hospital bed. Cassidy rehearsed a routine, rolling a rubber ball between her hands, talking through each step as she would with her young patients. Brave watched from the shadows, ears pricked, the jingle of the bell, the soft thump of the ball on the wooden floor. Something about it drew him forward. Cassidy looked up, smiling, and held out the ball. Brave's nose brushed her palm, gentle and uncertain, and Cassidy's heart leapt. For the first time, she felt the bridge between them strengthen, built from small acts of patience and trust. A week later, Cassidy faced a difficult decision. Hazel's parents, desperate for anything that might coax their daughter out of her shell, had asked if Cassidy might bring an animal to the hospital. The risk was real. Brave still spooked at loud noises, and the hospital, for all its good intentions, was an alien world of beeping machines and anxious energy. But something in Brave's steadying presence felt right for Hazel, whose trauma was more than physical. Cassidy arranged a visit on a quiet Saturday morning. She led Brave through the empty corridors, her steps measured, her own nerves jangling. Brave trembled at first. Metal doors, antiseptic smells, the echo of footsteps down the hall. But he kept his head close to Cassidy's side, as if trusting her to guide him through the maze. Hazel sat curled on the hospital bed, face half hidden by a plush rabbit. Her mother watched with wary hope as Cassidy led Brave to the bedside. The horse stood quietly, eyes soft, and Cassidy knelt beside Hazel, offering her the rubber ball from the barn. "Would you like to show Brave how you roll the ball?" Cassidy asked, keeping her voice gentle, the tone she used with all her most frightened kids. For a long moment, Hazel didn't move. Then, almost imperceptibly, she reached out and touched Brave's neck. The horse didn't flinch. He lowered his head until his nose nearly touched Hazel's hand. A hush fell over the room, thick and reverent. Cassidy watched as Hazel traced the white blaze on Brave's forehead, her fingers hesitant but growing steadier. Tears welled in Hazel's mother's eyes. "She hasn't touched anyone in weeks," she whispered, voice trembling. Cassidy felt something shift inside her, a surge of gratitude and awe. Brave, helping others, was healing himself, just as Cassidy, by showing up for Hazel, was beginning to heal some wound in her own heart. She understood then that recovery was never a solitary journey. It was always a crossing, back and forth, between lives, an endless exchange of courage, patience, and hope. Back at the barn, Dr. Finch came by to check on Brave's progress. She watched as Cassidy brushed Brave's mane, noting the horse's calmer posture, the new fullness in his coat. "He looks good, Cassidy," Dr. Finch said, scribbling notes. "Have you thought about letting him do more therapy work? There aren't many horses like him." Cassidy hesitated. "I don't know if he's ready, if I'm ready." But as she glanced at Brave, who was watching her, ears forward, as if waiting for a cue, she saw a flicker of something bright, an echo of the hope Jamie once had for this gentle horse. "Maybe you're both more ready than you think," Dr. Finch replied. The suggestion lingered in Cassidy's mind, even as she busied herself with chores. Brave, for his part, seemed to blossom with each passing week. He followed Cassidy to the paddock, nosed at the therapy toys, even let a few neighborhood kids pet him through the fence. Each new act of courage, no matter how small, felt like a triumph. One evening, as twilight bled into the sky, Cassidy sat in the barn, her phone buzzing with messages from Hazel's grateful parents. She listened to the night sounds, frogs singing, crickets chirping, Brave's contented sighs, and let herself believe for the first time in years that things might truly change. She traced her fingers along Brave's halter, the faded word hope shining in the dim light. They weren't healed, not fully. Some days were still hard, but as Brave pressed his head gently against her shoulder, Cassidy understood. Hope wasn't a finish line. It was the willingness to keep moving, one uncertain step at a time, toward something better. And in the hush of the barn, surrounded by the quiet heartbeat of new beginnings, Cassidy found the smallest certainty. She and Brave had both survived. And now, together, they were learning, slowly and bravely, to live again. Late April sunshine splashed the hills around Cassidy's home with a green so bright it seemed almost reckless. The barn, once a hollow refuge, felt transformed. Warm hay scent in the air, Brave's coat glinting in the slant of morning light, a rhythm of healing threading quietly through their days. Yet beneath this peace, Cassidy knew a new current was stirring. The past, Brave's, Jamie's, and her own, was never far from the surface. One Saturday, as Cassidy finished mucking stalls, a car pulled up near the gate. She watched, a little tense, as a woman stepped out. Tall, tired, her movements uncertain. Cassidy recognized her from old photos sent by Dr. Finch. Jamie's mother, Laura Weston. She carried a battered cardboard box hugged tight to her chest, as if holding something precious and breakable. Laura approached the barn slowly. Cassidy met her outside, uncertain what to say. The air between them was heavy, full of everything unspoken. I hope it's all right that I came, Laura said, voice raw. I've thought about him every day, about Brave, about Jamie. Cassidy nodded, stepping aside to let her in. Brave, sensing something different, watched them from his stall, ears pricked, eyes full of questions. Cassidy could feel his uncertainty echoing her own. Laura set the box on a bale of hay, opening it with trembling hands. Inside were drawings, childish sketches of horses and stars, a faded ribbon, a tiny rubber dinosaur, a plastic sheriff's badge, and a stack of notes written in a child's hand. She lifted a letter, the paper creased and soft with handling. Jamie made this box after he got sick, Laura whispered. He called it his memory box. Everything inside meant something, even if I didn't always understand. Cassidy swallowed. Would you like to read the letter? Maybe Brave should hear it too. Laura nodded, and together they knelt in the straw beside Brave's stall. Laura read, voice catching on each word. If you're scared, Brave will wait with you, like he waited for me. He never leaves you alone, even when it hurts. I hope someone takes care of him when I can't. I hope he helps kids who feel like me. The words hung in the barn, the simplest truths often the hardest to speak. Cassidy felt her throat close, thinking of all the children who'd waited for hope in hospital rooms, of all the nights she'd lain awake wishing someone would wait with her too. Laura set the letter beside Brave's feed bucket, wiping her cheeks. He was the best friend Jamie ever had. I couldn't bear to say goodbye. I let him down. I let Jamie down. Cassidy touched her arm. You were hurting. You lost your son. No one's strong every day. She paused, searching for the right words. But Brave isn't lost. He's here, he remembers. So do you. Brave, as if sensing the tension ease, stepped closer. He sniffed the memory box, nosing at the trinkets. pausing at the rubber dinosaur, nudging it until it toppled over. Cassidy saw something shift in his expression, a softening she hadn't seen before. That night, after Laura left, Cassidy sat in the barn, the letter in her lap. She read it aloud again, this time just for Brave. "If you're scared, Brave will wait with you, like he waited for me." The words seemed to settle into the wood, into the hay, into the tired bones of the horse and the woman beside him. Cassidy realized that Jamie's hope, his simple, stubborn belief in Brave's goodness, wasn't gone. It was alive, stitched into every gentle routine, every soft moment of trust reclaimed. Inspired by Jamie's wish, Cassidy resolved to try what she'd only half dared to consider. She would train Brave, officially, for therapy work again. Not just for Hazel, but for any child who needed the kind of presence that didn't vanish when life turned difficult. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, failures, hard days. But Cassidy saw now that Brave wasn't the only one being asked to trust, to risk his heart for the chance to help another. She began small. Each morning, she guided Brave through gentle exercises, rewarding patience and calm. She brought in noisemakers, new toys, let local kids and their parents stop by to watch or say hello. Brave shied from sudden movement at first, but with Cassidy's steady hand and voice, he learned to wait, to breathe, to accept unfamiliar touch. He excelled in moments with anxious or grieving children, almost as if he could sense the pain behind their guarded eyes and responded with a gentle patience born of his own wounds. Word began to spread. Cassidy started a wait list for sessions, overwhelmed and grateful all at once. Brave became known as the quiet healer, the horse who stood beside you, silent and steady, until you found the courage to reach out. But every story carried shadows. Late one afternoon, a new patient arrived. Her name was Olivia, a small girl with dark, watchful eyes clutching a faded blanket. Olivia refused to speak, wouldn't enter the barn, wouldn't touch Brave, only watched from the doorway, eyes wide with a complicated blend of hope and terror. Cassidy didn't press. She let Olivia watch, let Brave be brave, patient and calm, each waiting for the other to risk the first step. In the hush of that twilight, Cassidy saw herself reflected in both. A child, a horse, a woman, each waiting for trust to find them again. That night, as Cassidy turned out the barn lights, she paused beside Brave, her hand resting on his wide white blaze. "Tomorrow we try again," she whispered. "Together. Always together." And in the dark, Brave breathed softly, the memory of Jamie's hope wrapping around them both like a promise. Thunder rippled over the hills as dawn pressed against the stable's windows. Rain battered the tin roof in steady sheets, muting the world to gray. Cassidy stood in the barn, listening to the distant rumble. She knew from years of therapy work how storms unsettled children, how the vibration of thunder could awaken old fears, turn silence sharp. This morning, Olivia was coming again. The girl's case file was thin, recent trauma, few words, a shyness so deep her parents worried she might never speak again. Cassidy felt the old pressure in her chest. What if she couldn't help? What if Brave failed too? She glanced at the horse, who stood by the open stall door, muscles tense, nostrils testing the charged air. Olivia arrived with her mother just as the storm peaked, shoes soaked, hair clinging to her cheeks. She clutched her worn blanket, standing frozen in the barn's doorway, wide-eyed as the rain slammed down. Her mother knelt, whispered encouragements, but Olivia wouldn't move. Cassidy stepped forward, her own voice as steady as she could make it. "You don't have to come in," You can just watch. Brave's a little nervous, too. Storms make everyone feel small. The horse shifted, restless, ears flicking toward Olivia and the rain. For a long minute, the three of them existed in the liminal space between outside and in, between fear and courage. Cassidy busied herself with the feed buckets, humming Jamie's old lullaby under her breath. She caught Brave's eye, nodding toward Olivia. The horse took a step forward, then another, until he stood just inside the open door. Raindrops rolled from Brave's wide white blaze, darkening his mane. He stayed perfectly still, muscles coiled, as Olivia stared at him. Cassidy waited, her own heart pounding, knowing that the next move had to belong to the child. A long, tense silence. Thunder cracked overhead. Olivia flinched but didn't run. Instead, she watched as Brave lowered his head, breathing slow, eyes soft. With a trembling hand, Olivia reached out. Her fingers hovered in the air, so close that Cassidy could almost feel the ache of hope. Then, almost impossibly, Olivia stepped forward and pressed her palm to Brave's neck. The barn seemed to hold its breath. Cassidy blinked back tears, afraid to speak, to break the spell. Brave did not move, did not startle. He simply stood, letting the child's touch root him in the storm. Olivia's mother pressed her fist to her mouth, silent tears streaming down her face. Cassidy let the moment stretch. Olivia's hand lingered on Brave's neck, small and sure, tracing the scar and the white blaze. The horse's eyes closed in quiet acceptance. "Good job, Olivia," Cassidy finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Brave is so lucky to have you here." Olivia's lips parted. For the first time, she spoke. So soft, Cassidy almost missed it. "He's brave." Cassidy smiled, warmth blooming in her chest. "He is, and so are you." From that moment, something shifted. Olivia's visits became the anchor of her week. Each time she came, she got a little braver, brushing Brave's mane, feeding him apples, even helping clean his hooves. With each task, she found her voice, her laughter, her place in the barn's small community. News traveled fast. Other parents called Cassidy, their voices full of hope and exhaustion. Word spread about the therapy horse who had waited for a child to find her way back to the world. Brave's story echoed through the hospital halls and down church pews and school parking lots. The barn, once a sanctuary for one lost soul, became a beacon for many. One day, the hospital director called. She'd heard about Olivia, about Brave's gentle patience, about the children who left Cassidy's sessions changed. "We'd like to make your work official, Cassidy. Animal-assisted therapy, on campus, with our kids. You and Brave together." Cassidy hesitated. The idea was thrilling, terrifying, a new level of responsibility. Could she do this? Could Brave? But as she looked out at the barnyard, Olivia feeding Brave, a pair of siblings waiting their turn by the fence, Brave standing steady in the swirl of children's laughter, Cassidy felt a quiet confidence settle in. She met Brave's gaze, recalling the first night she'd found him on the road, hollowed out by loss. Now his eyes reflected something bright, unbroken, full of the lives he'd helped change. Cassidy smiled, thinking of Jamie's letter. "If you're scared, Brave will wait with you." That afternoon, Olivia helped Cassidy paint a sign for the barn. Her letters were crooked, colors splashed everywhere, but the words were clear. "Brave hearts, hope lives here." As the sun broke through the clouds, Cassidy watched Olivia and Brave in the golden light, her own heart full. She knew there would still be hard days, setbacks, old ghosts haunting the edges, but she also knew, with certainty, that healing, real healing, was happening here. Slow, messy, miraculous. Brave, once abandoned, was now the heart of something larger than either of them. And as another family arrived, a small boy gripping his mother's hand, Cassidy greeted them with a smile and an open door, ready to begin again. Sunlight spilled over the paddocks, warming the hillsides and filling the barn with golden dust. What once felt like a place for the lost was now pulsing with life. Children's laughter tangled with the nickers of horses, the comforting shuffle of boots on straw. Cassidy's Brave Hearts program had become more than a quiet experiment. It was a lifeline, not just for the kids who came seeking comfort, but for the adults and horses who gathered around them, each carrying wounds in need of healing. Every morning, Cassidy made her rounds, coffee mug in hand, pausing at each stall. She checked Brave first, brushing out his mane, checking for scrapes, whispering thanks into the wide white blaze on his forehead. Brave had become the barn's steady anchor, a living promise that broken things could mend, that old scars could become soft places where light got in. Children arrived in twos and threes, some shy, some wild with hope. There was Mason, who had lost the use of his legs but learned to guide a pony with only a voice command. There was Sophia, who barely spoke after her father died, now giggling as Brave snuffled at her jacket pockets in search of treats. Every day, Cassidy witnessed small miracles, hands that trembled less, smiles blooming in faces long haunted by sadness. Brave moved among the children like an old friend, patient and unhurried. If a child froze or panicked, he stood perfectly still, offering nothing but his presence. For those who dared a step forward, he leaned his head just close enough for their hands to find warmth and reassurance in his coat. Cassidy often stood back, letting the horse do his quiet work. More and more she saw herself in the children, the struggle to trust, the longing to be understood, the fragile hope that someone would wait for you in the dark. Community grew around the barn in ways Cassidy hadn't imagined. Parents volunteered to mend fences and paint gates. Retired horse trainers showed up with extra tack. Teens from the high school came after classes to muck stalls or feed the chickens, drawn by word of mouth and the simple need to belong. The barn echoed with voices and music, with potluck dinners and bonfires in the paddock, with stories traded over fences as the sun went down. In the middle of it all was Brave, who never sought the spotlight but became its quiet center. One afternoon, a television crew visited, cameras trailing as Brave led a group of children through gentle stretching exercises. The reporter asked Cassidy what made Brave special. She answered honestly, "He lets you feel what you feel. He doesn't rush you or fix you. He just stands with you until you're ready to take the next step." She could have been speaking of herself too. There were setbacks, of course. Days when children retreated, overwhelmed by memories or pain. Nights when Brave stood at the paddock fence, silent and distant. And Cassidy worried the old ghosts might never leave for good. But every morning, the work began again. Cassidy reminded herself and her team that healing was not a straight path. It twisted and circled, sometimes seeming to vanish, then returning when you least expected it. One bright Saturday, Cassidy heard a familiar laugh in the driveway. She turned to see Michael, her brother, walking toward the barn, taller than she remembered, his face older, more cautious, but unmistakably him. He carried a duffel bag and a hesitant smile. Cassidy's breath caught, heart pounding with hope and old regret. "I heard about what you're doing," Michael said, voice rough with nerves. "Thought maybe you could use another pair of hands." She hugged him, fiercely, feeling years of distance melt away. For hours, Michael helped with chores, learning each horse's quirks, asking questions about the kids, the therapy routines. Brave's story. He listened as Cassidy told him about the days she'd felt lost, about the hope she'd found in showing up again and again, even when she was scared. That afternoon, as the barn buzzed with laughter, Michael offered to help a new boy saddle a pony. Cassidy watched them from a distance, feeling something she hadn't dared hope for in years. Family, forgiveness, a path forward. When Michael slipped a photo of their parents into the barn's memory box, she wept. And Michael simply put an arm around her shoulders. "We're both here now," he said. "We made it." That evening, Cassidy and Michael sat on the porch as Brave grazed nearby, the sky turning pink and gold. Cassidy looked at her brother, at the barn glowing with lantern light, and felt the ache of old grief mingling with a bright, hard-earned joy. Inside the barn, Olivia was helping a new child practice feeding Brave. Sophia showed Mason how to braid a halter. Brave stood in the center, quiet and watchful, ears tuned to every sound. For the first time, Cassidy didn't feel alone in her work. Her old grief, sharp as it sometimes was, felt woven into something larger now, softened by the laughter and hope echoing through the barn. This wasn't just her story, or Brave's, or even Jamie's. It belonged to all of them. The families who came seeking healing, the community that gathered in the name of hope, the brother she'd finally found her way back to. And as dusk deepened and the world quieted, Cassidy felt certain that the hardest things, loss, loneliness, fear, could be transformed, not erased, by the simple, stubborn act of showing up for each other. Brave had led the way. The rest of them, she realized, just had to keep following. The first wild daffodils were blooming along the fence line when Cassidy received Laura Weston's text. "It's Jamie's anniversary. Would you and Brave come with me?" Cassidy read the message in the barn, sunlight spilling across the hay. She thought of Jamie's letter, now framed beside Brave's stall, and how his hope had become the heart of all they did. That afternoon, Cassidy loaded Brave into the trailer, Michael riding up front with her, silent and steady. Laura waited at the cemetery gate, a small bouquet in her arms, her eyes bright with memory and grief. Cassidy walked beside her as they made their way up the hill. Brave's halter blew against the fresh grass, the word hope glinting faintly where sunlight touched the faded threads. Jamie's grave was simple, a smooth stone, scattered wildflowers, and a well-worn toy dinosaur tucked at the base. Laura knelt and laid her bouquet on the grave, then rested her palm atop the stone. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to pause, thick with meaning. Cassidy stood a little apart, letting the moment belong to Laura and her son. She saw Brave lower his head, breathing slow and deep. Standing so still he seemed a part of the earth itself. Laura glanced at Cassidy and then at the horse. He waited for Jamie. He waited for me. For all of us, I think. Cassidy nodded. She remembered her first days with Brave, the rawness of his wounds, the way he'd stared at the empty barn door for hours. Now he stood steady and gentle, a bridge between loss and hope, between the lives that had been shattered and those still being rebuilt. Michael joined Laura, quietly tucking a photograph of Jamie into the grass. Cassidy watched as Brave nosed the air, then stepped closer, pressing his muzzle to Laura's shoulder. Laura let herself lean into him, the contact as natural and necessary as breath. "He still remembers," she whispered. "He remembers the love, not just the pain." The silence was full, not empty. pain, love, gratitude, and forgiveness mingling in the bright spring air. Cassidy found herself reflecting on everything that had brought them here. The children Brave had comforted, the families who had found hope again, her own journey from hollowed-out survival to belonging and purpose. It struck her how healing had not come from forgetting pain or moving past it, but from facing it, together, with the ones who needed her most. Cassidy understood that her scars, Brave's scars, the scars of everyone gathered here, were not signs of weakness or failure. They were places where new light had entered, evidence that wounds could mend, not by erasing the past, but by letting it shape a gentler future. As Laura and Michael shared stories of Jamie, Cassidy walked Brave along the quiet path bordering the cemetery. She talked to him in the hush, remembering how, in the earliest days, she had whispered her own grief into his battered ears. Brave listened, as always, steady, patient, unhurried. She realized that the greatest lesson Brave had taught was not about courage or resilience, but about presence. He had shown her that sometimes the most important thing you can offer is simply to stand beside someone in their pain, unafraid of the dark. As they made their way back to the barn, Laura squeezed Cassidy's hand. "You gave him a second chance," she said softly. "You gave all of us one." That evening, Cassidy gathered the Brave Hearts team, Michael, the volunteers, the children and their families, beneath a wide oak outside the barn. The air was soft, alive with the smells of grass and wood smoke, laughter and distant music. Brave stood among them, children braided flowers into his mane, his patience endless. Cassidy spoke quietly, her voice reaching for every soul gathered in the golden light. Healing isn't about forgetting what hurt us. It's about carrying it together, letting it become part of our story. Every scar means we survived. Every act of kindness, no matter how small, changes the world for someone. The children listened, some playing with hay, others leaning into their parents. Michael tossed an arm around her shoulders. Laura sat nearby, hands folded over Jamie's memory box. Cassidy looked at Brave, remembering how close she'd come to giving up. How, if she'd driven past that foggy road 1 minute later, everything would be different. Now, because of a single act of care, ripples of hope reached through dozens of lives. Jamie's, Laura's, Michael's, her own, and all the children who found their courage in Brave's patient gaze. As dusk settled, Cassidy watched the barn glow from within. Lanterns flickering, families gathered at tables, laughter echoing into the night. She felt a peace she'd never known. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of connection. The barn was no longer a place for the lost. It was a place where scars were honored, where every broken piece had found its place in the mosaic of new beginnings. Cassidy closed her eyes, breathing in the night air. Healing, she realized, was not a single journey, but a shared road. You didn't have to walk it alone. The value of a wounded life was not diminished by scars. Sometimes those scars were the very places where hope and love could enter. And as Brave nuzzled her shoulder, Cassidy knew that, whatever storms might come, she was ready. Not because she was unbroken, but because she was finally, truly not alone. Spring in Asheville brought a shimmer to the hills, 1,000 shades of green unfurling beneath soft blue skies. On a Saturday morning that hummed with promise, Cassidy stood in the newly painted paddock, watching families arrive for the opening of the Brave Hearts barn. Balloons bobbed from the gateposts, children's voices rang out across the yard, and sunlight pooled in golden puddles on the grass. If there was a word for this moment, Cassidy thought, it was gratitude. Complex, deep, and alive in every cell of her being. Brave stood at the center of it all, his brown coat sleek, his wide white blaze catching the light. He wore Jamie's old blue halter, freshly scrubbed but still bearing the faint, hand-stitched word, hope. As Cassidy led him to the gate, a hush fell over the crowd. Brave moved with the same gentle patience he always had, but today, he seemed to carry a different weight, a legacy now shared with every family gathered here. Children reached for him, hands open, faces lit with anticipation and a touch of awe. Brave lowered his head, letting each child stroke his neck, ruffle his mane, or whisper secrets into his ear. Cassidy watched, heart pounding with quiet joy, as even the shyest children found courage in Brave's steady presence. Olivia, once so frightened she couldn't cross the barn's threshold, now walked at Brave's side, one hand twined in his halter, the other pointing out the names she'd painted on the new barn sign. Brave hearts, hope lives here. Cassidy stepped to the front, her voice trembling as she looked at the families, the volunteers, the kids she'd watched change, sometimes slowly, sometimes in a blink. "Thank you," she said, voice thick with emotion, "for helping me and Brave find our way home. This barn isn't just a place for horses or therapy. It's a place for second chances, for every person and animal who's ever felt alone, for every family who needed hope." As she spoke, Jamie's mother, Laura, moved through the crowd and clasped Cassidy's hand. For a moment, they simply stood together, two women who had lost and loved and found something new in the ashes. "You didn't just save him," Laura whispered. "You saved all of us." Michael joined them, grinning as he handed out lemonade and cookies to kids who'd once been too afraid to look anyone in the eye. Cassidy caught his gaze, her brother's forgiveness a quiet balm that made everything seem possible. The day unfolded in a joyful blur. Horses trotted through obstacle courses, led by children with uncertain gaits but unbreakable spirits. Parents and volunteers shared stories over picnic tables, laughter ringing out in the warm air. Cassidy's therapy kit, once just a basket of worn toys and dog-eared books, now sat beside a wall covered in children's artwork, thank you cards, and photos of horses and their humans. Brave's halter, Jamie's memory box, and Olivia's painted sign became the small altars of this new beginning. At noon, Cassidy gathered everyone in a wide circle. The kids sat on blankets, horses grazing at the edge. Cassidy took a breath, feeling her own scars, her old fears, and her new strength stitched together in a patchwork of experience and love. "I used to believe that bravery meant never being afraid," she said, searching the faces around her. "But I've learned that real bravery is showing up for someone else, especially when you're scared yourself. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is pull over for a lost horse, or open your door to a stranger, or ask for help, even when you think you should be able to do it alone." She paused, letting the words settle. Brave stepped forward, standing at her side, his warm breath stirring her hair. "What we build here isn't just about horses, or therapy, or even hope. It's about choosing kindness every day. It's about leaving the door open for each other, no matter how many times we've been hurt." Jamie's mother squeezed her hand. Olivia beamed. Michael wiped at his eyes, unashamed. Cassidy continued, her voice soft but certain. "The legacy of kindness is always bigger than any one loss. That's what makes us human. That's what makes us whole." Children and families clapped, laughter spilling out across the paddock. Brave led a line of children through the pasture, each child holding the halter or resting a hand on his side, their faces alight with trust. Cassidy watched as the parade wound beneath the arching oaks, the air thick with bird song and the promise of new beginnings. As afternoon melted into evening, lanterns flickered along the fence line. Parents lingered, trading phone numbers and stories. Volunteers swept out the barn, singing snatches of songs. Cassidy sat on the back step, shoes kicked off, her heart a mix of exhaustion and awe. Sunset set the sky ablaze, pink, orange, and violet streaks painting the fields. Cassidy walked with Brave through the pasture, side by side, their shadows long against the grass. She felt the weight of all that had happened. The pain, the patience, the tiny acts of care that had changed so many lives, herself included. Children's laughter echoed from the barn. Michael called her name. Brave lifted his head, as if to say, "We made it. We're here." Cassidy smiled, tears blurring her vision, grateful for every scar, every day she'd almost given up, every person who had joined her on this journey. Hope wasn't just a word stitched into a halter. It was a living thing, a force that carried them forward, always into the light.